Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, A History of the Shroud of Turin, a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today we'll be speaking with Bob Siefker. He's one of the preeminent experts on the Shroud. We'll be talking about a handful of topics and look forward to the discussion. But before we get started, I wanted to tell a short story. There's many hints to the Shroud over the history of the Shroud, and there's even a couple that are in the Bible. And in particular, there's one with Paul in Galatians 3:1, where he says, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified." Well, don't know exactly whether that was a reference to the Shroud, but it certainly could have been. Anyway, most evidence of the Shroud comes from Luke, that the women and Peter found the cloth in the tomb, and there are many other evidences that seem to show that there was a special cloth related to Jesus' burial in the tomb. And it is that we're going to talk about today. That is what all the fuss is about. So with that, let me introduce Bob Siefker. Bob was brought up in California and attended UCLA on a Navy scholarship with a major in engineering. I was an engineer too, and in the meantime, I've now gone over to the dark side of marketing and other things, but I started as an engineer as well. After his nearly 5 years of naval service, he worked on the software industry, eventually serving as VP for 2 different software companies, the second being in Colorado. And it was in Colorado that he became an associate of the Turin Shroud Center, headed by Dr. John Jackson. And he, as you all know, was the leader of the 1978 Shroud of Turin Research Project, also known as STURP. Bob has been co-author and editor of the TSC book on the Shroud entitled The Shroud of Turin, a critical summary of the observations, data, and hypotheses. And there's some really good stuff on that, and I definitely recommend people to go off and purchase that. And most recently, he has been involved in the research on the so-called miracle of the Holy Fire, which I find just fascinating. It's a phenomenon that occurs every year at the tomb of Christ in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem on Orthodox Holy Saturday. With that, Bob, thank you for being here, and let's get started.
Thanks for the nice introduction. Good to be here, Guy. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Yeah, absolutely. I'm very looking forward to your explanation on certainly the Shroud and the miracle of the Holy Fire, and also some of the other stuff that you've been working on. So with that, why don't you tell us what your backstory is on how you got involved in the Shroud of Turin?
Well, it all comes from my career in the software industry, and going from California to the Denver area to join a software company there. And it was while I was working in Denver that I met John Jackson. I was on the church council of our church, and they said, "Bob, we'd like you to schedule a speaker to come in and talk to us." You know, they did this a couple times a year. And I did some research, and I ran across the Shroud of Turin, being in Colorado. Hadn't known much about it before, although I had been introduced to the Shroud. Interestingly, I was given some images of the Shroud by my grandmother when I was a little kid, and so I had some knowledge of it. But I ended up asking John to come talk to the church, and he said, "Hey, by the way, Bob, if you'd like, we've got room for volunteers." And this was almost at the time that I was set for retiring. I retired early, I was fortunate. After retiring, by the way, from the software industry, I went back to the Graduate School of Theology in Berkeley, California with my wife and I. Our kids were grown, and got a master's in theology there. And it was about that time that I met John Jackson, and spent 15 years of hard work working with him and volunteering and helping in any way I could. For the last 2 years, my focus has been drawn to working with Giulio Fanti on some research on the Holy Fire. Equally, maybe even more stunning stuff to share on that. But the shroud is an unbelievable object. It's got my attention that I fully believe. One of the conversations I had with Fonte was in the critical summary. I said it's a rational judgment. After you look at all the data on the shroud, it's a supported rational judgment to come to the conclusion that it's the real thing. And Fonte went, "That's stupid." He said, "I know the shroud is authentic." And I have to grapple with that. I think I know it's authentic too. I know it's a supported rational judgment based on the evidence to come to that conclusion, but some people don't or won't, either way. But I think Fonte's closer to my position today, that I am absolutely convinced the shroud is authentic. And I am absolutely also convinced that the holy fire phenomenon is authentic. And one of the, we'll get into the linkage between the two, but one buttresses the other. The holy fire, when they found the shroud in the tomb, you read from that gospel passage. It was nighttime. The women had run to get John and report to John that they'd taken the body. And they came back, it was still dark, and they were able to see in the tomb. And the Orthodox position is that's because there was light in the tomb. The tomb was bright with light. There's talk of an angel being there with lit up angel, but the tomb supposedly was dazzling with light when John showed up, and he was able to see into it in the early morning before daybreak, and see the shroud and see the other cloths in there. So when you look at it, we've always needed an explanation, because when you look for an explanation of the shroud image, you always end up with it's got to be because it's scorched onto the cloth. It's not painted or marked onto the cloth. It's not a body image from sweat or any material other than scorching of the material itself, which is a product of some kind of interaction with radiation or light. So it's been a mystery. What is the source of that light? And I think we now know it's God. Jesus said, "I will give you a sign, the sign of Jonah, 3 days in the tomb." And like the saying says, there's a connection. The light of the holy fire is the source of the shroud's image, and the shroud is a one-time event. The holy fire is a repeating event, which is very powerful for those that know it. Most people have never heard of it.
Yeah, it certainly is, and interesting perspective that there was light in the tomb, because it had to come from somewhere. And although potentially the you could maybe imagine if they're traveling at night, the women, and they go into the tomb, they're probably traveling or walking with a torch of some kind. So maybe that was it. But certainly, there were the two angels that were in there that could have been lighting it up. And certainly it could have also been this concept of the holy fire or something else that generated all of that radiation that was still residual or something like that. And very interesting. I was wondering, do you want to start with the work you're doing with the holy fire first, or do you want to do some of the work that you did on the critical summary of observations? Whichever one.
Let's start, Guy, with the critical summary. I was the editor and primary writer on that, although the effort was totally a team effort of the whole Turin Shroud Center staff, John Jackson, others there that worked with John, but I was the primary writer for the critical summary.
And before we get started on that, where can you purchase that book?
The best bet is, unfortunately, it's not on Amazon. It's on a small publishing company in the Chicago area, CMJ Publishing, and they sell books. The best way is to go to the Turin Shroud Center website, and there's a link to buy the book there.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. So, and I'll try and repeat that a little later. So,
shroudofturin.com.
Yep, shroudofturin.com, and what a great domain name, certainly. So perfect place to go, and then also to link over to purchase that book. So tell us about the book. What's in the book, and how is it organized? Because it has a very interesting organization and classification of all of the different observations concerning the shroud.
Yeah, it's basically the areas of research that you can conduct on the shroud: historical research, research on the cloth itself. With or without an image, can you date that cloth back to the first century? So you've got the shroud itself as a cloth. You've got the image on the shroud. You've got medical forensics. There's a lot of medical forensics that's displayed on the shroud that you can come to some very pointed conclusions relative to what happened to the image, the person associated with the image on the shroud. So you've got the cloth itself, the image on the cloth, the medical forensics, which can be studied independently because the shroud reveals all kinds of details about the suffering and the effects of execution through crucifixion. So you've got a section on medical. Then there's a section on the history of the shroud. What is the history through the ages? Can you take that history logically back from what we possess today to a first century origin? So you look at the history. Then you look at image formation hypotheses, because since we've entered the scientific age, the shroud was revered by the church, but there was no explanation for it with scientific research. So once scientific research started on the shroud, a number of different image formation hypotheses were proposed. Some came from a negative point of view. Oh, it was just this, or oh, it was just that. So you have to look at all the different image formation hypotheses and rate those. So it was organized along that line, Guy. What is the shroud as a cloth? What is the medical forensics about the cloth? What about the image itself? What about the segregating and putting into different pockets these various image formation hypotheses, and then some conclusions from all of
it. Yeah, and I like that. I don't know, I guess maybe it's my engineering background or me just looking for the facts. What I really liked about it was that you have all of these different facts, or near facts, I guess you might be able to call them. And then I like the way they were classified. And then the second thing you do, though, is you classify them as well by whether they're firmly supported or generally supported, or maybe documented but kind of disputed. And so how did you come up with that classification?
Well, there are obviously some issues about the shroud that have been brought up through history that just don't make sense. Or they make sense, but you can't support them from a scientific point of view. And really, there are very few issues in the book that are classified as doubtful, that we would see, the Shroud Center of Colorado would say, we can't look at that as any positive. It's there, but we can't give it any weight for evidence purposes. There are only a couple. So the book itself focuses on those things that are pretty well supported, and class 1 evidence, which says it's strongly supported, is the primary content of the book. There are a couple out there that are thrown around, one of which is that there are image of flowers and coins over the eyes and things like that. Those are less provable. You can see things, but you can't draw positive conclusions. It's circumstantial evidence at best.
Yeah, I had trouble with some of that. I mean, certainly the coin over the eye kind of makes sense. Maybe not. It's kind of more. It's the coins over the eyes were more of a Greek thing as opposed to a Christian or a Jewish thing. But the one that really got me were the flowers, and I think then there's some people that think the nails were next to him, and even maybe the Roman spear that was next to him as well. And I don't know. I can't. I've got a picture of the frontal side of the shroud, the full size from Barry Schwartz, and I can't find those flowers or anything like that on there. And my problem with the flowers, for example, is that if they're not on the body, and if the image is coming out vertically, then okay, they might be able to be seen. But if they're next to the body is believed to be the thing that generates the radiation. So how did the radiation form images of those flowers or whatever next to the body? And I don't know, maybe I'm going off in the wrong direction, but that's kind of what I was thinking.
You're raising an issue. We just said you can't really establish without many contingent doubts that there are images of flowers to begin with. Same thing with the coins over the eyes. Some people say, I can see it. But the average person and the TSC, with all of its scientific know-how, said, we don't see it. But others promote it. So for the most part, the critical summary stays with the evidence that is widely supported and supports itself once pointed out. So,
yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are very few items in there that we included that were not strongly supported by empirical evidence and stood up to very rigorous examination. So there are a couple out there, and most of them have to do with those third issues, like other things other than the body image. Coins, flowers, pollen, the significance of dirt on the, some people like to say, well, the dirt is exactly like only the dirt that you found in Jerusalem, travertine aragonite. Well, yeah, there's some indications of that, but it's not evidence that you can change your life with.
Yeah, it's kind of like in a court case, it's kind of more the circumstantial evidence as opposed to the actual, the fact, the hard kind of evidence, and whether that whether then that individually makes sense. But it's certainly when you add all of those pieces together, those class 1, the firmly supported versus the generally supported class 2, when you add all of those things together, and I think that was kind of what you were talking about, is the rational scientific mind then would say, yes, absolutely, this piece of linen cloth, this shroud, is the true burial cloth of Jesus.
Yeah. And we're kind of in a situation where we're in a trial. People are looking at this and saying, am I going to believe the shroud is authentically the burial cloth of Christ? I may not say that he was divine because I have that cloth, but is it even possible that we have that cloth in our possession? Well, you don't want to be dealing with a bunch of circumstantial things, because that decision, judgment, can be a life-saving judgment and a life-changing judgment.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember I gave a talk at a Shroud conference back in 2014 in St. Louis. It was a big conference on the Shroud, and I gave a talk on the critical summary. And I basically concluded by saying that we've produced this at the Shroud Center of Colorado. We've got all of the pertinent evidence in there. And we take the position that the shroud is authentic at the Shroud Center of Colorado, and this critical summary shows you why we take that. We believe it is a rational, fully supported rational judgment to come to that conclusion. And we have come to that conclusion. And we're convinced it's a rational decision to come to that conclusion. And I asked the audience, there were a couple hundred people there, and I said, how many people in this group here today have come to what they believe is a rational judgment, being very, we are not going to examine everybody's method of supporting a rational judgment, but just out of curiosity, how many here think that they have made the rational judgment that the shroud is authentic? And about 2/3 of the hands went up. And then I asked the second question. I said, and how many of you has that judgment changed your life? and essentially the same hands went up. So we don't need a lot of little fragmentary things. If it's not really overwhelming evidence, leave it out. Go to the evidence that you can support such a judgment with, and leave out all the other things. I mean, skeptics will want to bring up all kinds of little doubts and little things. There's not much.
Yeah.
But might as well, even if there's a little, like the coins over the eyes. What difference does it make?
Right.
And
right.
who cares? And
right.
Well, I see them. Well, most people don't. And most forensic evidence methods of trying to determine that there are coins over the eyes is not fully conclusive. So we just that kind of thing, and some of the flower stuff and some of the dirt stuff, leave it as class 3 evidence.
Yeah, and I think, and that's what I liked about the book in terms of being a good listing of all of the different pieces of evidence, and kind of, it's almost like you use the court analogy. It's kind of like you're the, I don't know, I guess it's the defense attorney or one of the attorneys, and you go, okay, well, here's all this evidence that we could show. Here's the stuff that's maybe not so good, but then look at the overwhelming evidence that says this is firmly supported by science, and therefore, when I present to the jury, I'm going to just stick with what is firmly supported, and leave all of the stuff that is potentially disputed, or whether it's the aragonite on the nose, or whether it's the flowers or the coins on the eyes. Those the kinds of things we don't have to bring up when we actually go to trial, so to speak. That
was pretty much our methodology.
Yeah, and that made a lot of sense. Now, of course, unfortunately, we always have to bring up the radiocarbon dating, and boy, did that put a stick in, that was definitely a fly in the ointment. So the radiocarbon dating from 1988, where it said 1260 to 1390, and so did that apply any impact on what you did with the book, or how did you look at that?
Well, we have a whole section on the carbon dating. And our take on that, the carbon dating was a botched effort on the shroud, and you can't draw any conclusions. In fact, it's been shown that the samples that now have been analyzed that were part of the carbon dating protocol show a different date across tiny samples. In millimeters of movement on those claws, you get a different result.
Yep.
So there's no consistency in the carbon dating. It was a rush job. It was poorly done. They didn't want to take much of a sample, so they took it out of the most inconspicuous but dirty and mended section of the shroud on a little corner. Terrible place to take the sample. There was no sample here, sample there, sample here. It was a faulty protocol, and it's hard to justify how it even happened, but it did. But recent, they've forced the labs that did just within the last year and a half or so into publicly disclosing all of their data and all of their methods of analysis, and basically the whole thing's fallen apart.
Yeah.
But remember this: we're dealing with something that certain forces in reality are opposed to. So any doubt gets magnified in the press, on the internet, and there are forces that want to say the shroud is not the burial cloth. The guys they'll take any doubts they can and try to magnify those. But we addressed the carbon dating. It was a botched. One of the things is, even on the same sample, as you move from point to point, you get a different time.
Yep.
Well, if you moved at that same rate to the middle of the shroud where the body is, you would have been at year 0. I mean, it's crazy. So
Yep.
One of the problems is they did the carbon dating without a proper protocol, biased the data, and then didn't allow any other further tests. I understand why they don't allow any further tests, because you're going to cut the shroud up into pieces, and So the Vatican, who is the owner of the shroud, it's in Turin, Italy, but it's owned by the Pope. It's part of the Holy See's property. They said no more carbon dating. Well, you can't go back and overturn it. You just have to say, we don't accept that first one. And there are many papers that have been written in the last 18 months that destroy the carbon datings. But you still go to Wikipedia, and
I know. Yep.
They're not going to go there.
Well, I call it the debunking of the debunkers.
Well, that's why you need some straightforward analysis. We think the critical summary will help people get to the true data, but there are other things coming out. Fonte has a couple of new books on coins that not on the shroud, but coins that were minted after the shroud was discovered, and you've got a total correlation between the images right back. They blow way past that 1290 date. You've got other evidence on the shroud that blows right past that 1290 date.
Absolutely. And the coins, I think the coins is one of the big ones. Certainly the Pantocrator images that are out there, and then even then the Pray manuscript and some of the other things, they're all well before that 1260 date. And it not only from the scientific analysis that was done and the statistical analysis that was done or botched or whatever you want to use as a term there, versus then all of the other proof that really shows, hey, here's evidence, from the 1100s with the Pray manuscript. Here's evidence from the 600s with the gold Solitas coins, and and then going back further to the 500s with the Pantocrator images and some of the other ones. It's just it's hard for me to believe that so many people see this one piece of evidence. And I don't even know if I'd want to use the term evidence for the radiocarbon dating that was done, but one potential data point, and not realize that there are all of these other ones, and that data point has been so debunked now that so it's totally gone. And yet now, how do we, as shroudists, I guess we'll call ourselves, how do we then get the message out that that thing is no longer valid and get the same level of press and exposure that they got, except now on the other side?
Well, there are new publications. There's a new book out, new history book out. I could go get I can't recall the author's name real quick. Give me 30 seconds.
Get it. Let's do that afterwards, okay, if you wouldn't mind.
But there's a new history book out on the shroud that is phenomenal, and it goes way back in time, where the correlation with historical events, where the shroud was moved, the cloth itself being moved much earlier than any carbon dating would indicate, right back into the 1st century. It's the shroud's movement.
For me, what I did is I took the Ian Wilson's The Blood in the Shroud book, and I basically then wrote a fiction. So instead of just going date by date by date and fact by fact by fact and whatever, so what I tried to do is I took about 10 different vignettes of dates, and then wrote a fictional story around that. So you have the shroud in Golgotha, and then at the tomb, and then you have the shroud potentially with Joseph of Arimathea, and then you have the shroud in Edessa, and then in Constantinople, et cetera, et cetera. And so then that's kind of how I got into it. And where I was trying to get to was, and one of the reasons for me to write this book was to kind of right the wrong, so to speak, and say, here is then a story that people can read, as opposed to just a bunch of facts and historical facts. Here's a story that somebody could read and kind of get an idea of actually what may have happened then to the shroud.
Yeah, that's a good book. Ian Wilson has done wonderful work, but he's actually been passed up now too. There's the new book that I've recalled, with author's name Jack Marquardt,
Oh yeah, I've got that one as well. Yep, he's
the new book that's just got published.
Yep, and it's on my reading list, but I've got a ways to go yet. It's but it's definitely there. I'm going to get to it here pretty soon.
It's a game changer too.
Yep.
But it's very technical, and you can't read it with the attention you need unless you already know quite a bit about the shroud.
Yeah.
But if you do, Ian was right about a lot, but he was also wrong about a lot. We don't even think the shroud was ever in Edessa.
Yeah.
It was there for a day, but it wasn't there for long. And Marquardt kind of buries the Edessa thing. So there's some new research on the history that just correlate back right to the tomb.
Yeah. He's got some interesting stuff.
Way past Harbin dating.
Yeah, he's got some interesting stuff about it going to Syria, and then Peter having it, and then of course the reference to Paul in Galatians potentially that he had it, or somebody that was close to Paul had it or showed it, and and that's, you know, so I've got the shroud going to Edessa and being in there with King Apgar, so you know, but who knows, right? But he's got some very good evidence, no question about it. I really appreciate what he's done.
We think, I can't say we think, but I think that Marquardt has got a superior history line.
Yeah,
they're very correlated, only disagreeing in certain areas that aren't really relevant to decision. But both of them blow past the 1290 carbon dating.
Oh yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's just a fiasco. I wish we could just say we don't want to talk about carbon dating. It's been debunked, but you have to.
I know you absolutely. Hopefully, you know, I liken it like this, you know, and hopefully the Pope now or the Catholic Church will allow another round of testing similar to what was done with Stirp in 1978, and I was. I kind of call it like the scientists, the shroud scientists are spending their 40 years in the desert, and that 40 years is now up, and so hopefully now we'll get another chance to do some real scientific research on it, using the latest methods and all the things that we know so far, and all of the things where there's some very interesting questions that could actually be resolved.
Yeah.
So
I don't disagree. I'd be very conservative on that, though. I would, you know, we're going to talk about another subject here today too, Guy, and I'd like to bring that in.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's move over to the Holy Fire then.
Okay, well, help direct the conversation and all this.
Absolutely. So, what's going on is, and Bob kind of mentioned it, what was the mechanism that may have actually generated the image that's on the shroud? And, you know, are they scorch marks? They're not paint, they're not pigments, they're not dyes, they're not all of these other things. And so something created that. And, you know, it had to have been, or it is most likely to have been a radiation event of some kind. Some think it's maybe light. Some think it's maybe you know, protons and electrons, and so then one of the things that's happening is this event of the Holy Fire, which takes place once a year in the shroud at the and I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to get the details wrong. So let me hand it over to you and go from there on in terms of what the Holy Fire is.
Okay, well, this is a phenomenon that goes back over 1,700 years. The tomb of Christ was desecrated early in history by the Romans. Jerusalem was captured by the Romans, and the tomb of Christ was filled with dirt, piles of dirt, and an idol tomb or an idol was built over the tomb, and it was basically inaccessible for centuries until the time of Constantinople, and so until about the 300s, when Constantine became emperor, the tomb of Christ was buried under a an idol-based structure of the Romans. And so when it was excavated and rebuilt, this Holy Sepulchre really for the first time, this phenomenon showed up almost at the same instant, even while the construction of the Holy Sepulchre. Once the tomb was uncovered and it was accessed, this phenomenon showed up. And the phenomenon was candles or torches being spontaneously lit. Now, nobody's suggesting that a torch or a candle is the form, but it was divine light manifesting itself, generally, historically, through candles being lit up and candles having a physical attribute that is inexplicable scientifically, at the tomb of Christ. And that's been going on for 1700 years. I had never heard of it until Giulio Fanti, another shroud researcher, asked the question in a paper, and you have that paper, I just hold it up. This is available on, you get it on the internet. And the question is that he asked is the holy fire related to the Turin shroud? That was his question. And I got a hold of that paper, and I can't remember whether Giulio emailed me or whatever, but I read that paper. I had never heard of the phenomenon of the holy fire. It has existed strictly in the Eastern Orthodox community from day one, essentially. I mean, before the schism there, but it was the Eastern Church, the Church of Jerusalem, that had this phenomenon. It occurred on Easter Eve, excuse me, in one place, in the sepulchre of the Holy Sepulchre, Christ's tomb, on the rock on which he was laid. Mm-hmm. There are very few books on the topic, and all of them that are really of any account have come from Eastern Orthodox authors. So they're not the one. Here, this book I'll hold up right now is probably the most exact and interesting book you can read on the phenomenon. It's called, it's by Harris Skarlakidis, The Miracle of the Holy Light at the Resurrection Tomb of Jesus. And it's been going on for 1700 years, since the time of Constantine and the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it occurs. Now, if you go, just saying now, you say, well, let me go look that up. That must be on Wikipedia. Well, it is, and it's totally debunked. And yet, Fanti went, his paper, he was there. He went and did experimentation. Others have done experimentation. It's a phenomenon that I am convinced occurs every year. You can go on YouTube and watch it. It's very strange. It's very caught up with the history and culture of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is very different than the Western Church. You know, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. But this phenomenon, I'm convinced, occurs. And if you read Skarlakidis' book, I think you will too. There's another book out there called The Paschal Fire in Jerusalem, written by a bishop of the Orthodox Church. It happens to be an American, Bishop Oxientos of Fataki, but it's called The Paschal Fire in Jerusalem. Good to read. But what's going on now is there's more research going on this phenomenon and the history of the research. But if you back up from now and say, wait a minute, how does that connect to the shroud? You've got this fire, this spontaneous fire, and little lightning flashes, and candles that have been extinguished being lit up, and people holding there for 20 minutes or so. Once the fire is brought out of the edicule, where the tomb is, and the rock on which Jesus was buried, the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem is in there on Holy Saturday Eve by himself, essentially. A couple others are there watching to make sure he doesn't do anything false, supposedly. His candles are lit spontaneously. And then he takes it out and passes it to the crowd. And you can look at online and just look at it on YouTube.
Yeah, well, I've definitely put some links on this post here for that.
It's very different, and it's unconvincing until you get a hold of that flame, and then do some temperature with it and do some research on the flame. For 20 minutes, it doesn't burn.
That's incredible. That is incredible.
And then it becomes a normal fire again. So you see, Fonte put it under his beard and held it there. His beard didn't catch on fire, but he had two candles. He had a regular candle and one lit by a lighter and one lit by the fire that was passed from the tomb. They had totally different realities to them. One burned, the other didn't. After 10 minutes, they were both the same, normal fire.
That is incredible.
But here's the link. We need a source of radiation or light. We're not saying it's candlelight, but the candles are some manifestation of holy fire, holy radiation. We need that in the tomb, because when the disciples went in and saw the shroud there, we got the shroud, but we don't get the image without some form of radiation or light. It's etched onto the cloth. We need light or radiation. Well, the holy fire is a manifestation of light and radiation. But once you're given that quadrant of reality, light and radiation, God can use that however he wants. So was it Jesus's body becoming radiant with light, like at the Transfiguration, that caused the image on the shroud? The image of the shroud is not only there, it's three-dimensional. And John Jackson believes it passed through the radiant body of Christ and was etched onto the cloth. But once you have a source of divine light, that you say, we're dealing with divine light in the tomb of Christ once a year, in the edicule of the Holy Sepulchre, on the rock where Jesus was laid, and it's only there that it occurs.
Yeah.
You say, wait a minute, I can make a hypothesis, and that's what Fonte has done here. Is the holy shroud related to the fire? Fonte took the candle and singed some linen that he had brought with him when he was in he was able to get entrance to in 2019, and he used a candle, the one that came out of the other coin. He put cloth under it, and remarkable results. Gosh, it looks
that is fascinating. There's so many questions I'd like to talk to you about it. I don't know, we may have to do this on another call, but
here's my take on it, Guy. The shroud by itself, and I mentioned this to you, I think, in a conversation. The shroud is a complicated reality. It's got all kinds. So you can write the book of that we wrote for TSC has dozens and dozens of characteristics about the shroud image and its history and its medical forensics and all those forensics we talked about. It's a complex reality. By itself, to penetrate the human heart and mind and say, I'm authentic, is an arduous task. The holy fire is simple. It either is or it isn't. If you look at Wikipedia, they say, it isn't, and we're not going to let it be, by the way. They're going to do everything they can to say, we're not going to go there. But it is there. I mean, the two books, go read them. Go read about the history, the witnesses that have witnessed it, and the testimonies that have gone through the last 1,700 years. It's incredible. It's been going on exactly in the same way for 1,700 years at the tomb of Christ on the eve of Holy Sunday.
It is fascinating, and I will definitely look at those books and see if I can read through them. It's interesting too what you just said about, that you also started with, is that the tomb was destroyed by the Romans, which makes sense, and then it was buried, and then they put an idol over it, which also makes sense. And then it wasn't until Constantine was emperor and the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire that he then, opened it up. And I guess one of the other things is that if that holy fire is authentic, and it sure sounds like it is, then that also means that spot that has been tradition as being thought of as being the tomb is absolutely the tomb, because that phenomenon doesn't take place anywhere else. So therefore, that brings that together as well.
Yeah, there was the old story of the Garden Tomb and the Golgotha Tomb. Golgotha and the Tomb of Christ are right next to each other. The Garden Tomb doesn't have much traction anymore. This is the tomb, even without the holy fire.
I appreciate it, and unfortunately, I've got to cut us off here. But what maybe we'll do is we'll do another round specifically on the holy fire, and really go into detail there. And sorry, we ended up doing more on the critical summary book, which is also fascinating, and I really appreciate that. So, but anyway, Bob, thank you so much today. Really been awesome. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for participating. And for reference, the website is the shroudofturin.com, shroudofturin.com, and that's then for and maintained then by the Turin Shroud Research Center. Is that what it is?
Shroud of Turin Center of Colorado.
Center of Colorado, and so shroudofturin.com for more information, and definitely a link to that book that was mentioned, and then certainly other stuff. So with that, stay tuned for other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin, and please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy.